Hello, my friends. It is William with the new diary entry for the 1921, and I had my second lapse yesterday where I just didn't have time with all the activity going on to do the video for 1921. So apologies for that. And let's see, today we are up to the 24th of January. It's Monday. We're back in Paris. I won't give you Dimitri's address because you probably know it by heart by now. This is a complex one because it goes back in time a little to right the period pretty much right after the revolution, but it also goes forward. It has a little bit of French, the name of a place that I'm not going to be able to pronounce. But yeah, we better dive in. Okay. Old Baturin, whom I knew from Persia, came to see me around 11 o'clock. He recently arrived from Tehran and had a lot of interesting stories. It was terribly painful to hear his description of how the English shut down the Persian Cossack division, how they chased out Staroselsky and the other officers. So now there's absolutely no Russian influence left. After Baturin left, I went to Tir au Pigeon to play tennis on a covered court. My game was terrible after yesterday's late night. I lunched à deux with Coco at Larue. We had a wonderful time just sitting there until 3 or 4 in the afternoon. Afterwards, I went to Maria's and then to the Travelers. I dined at the home of Nina de Polignac. Linda and Cole were there, and Mrs. Gray, whose maiden name is Deacon. I knew her in Rome and Paris in 1914. The dinner was very successful, and we ended up going to the Bat. After the theater, Pete Polovtsov and I went to the Travelers. Luders was there, as a result of which we got frightfully drunk. I got home completely lit at 3 a.m. Okay, so as I said, lots to unpack in this one, and I should just recap yesterday's diary entry that Dimitri had been with his sister and brother-in-law and at a friend at the Ritz, but he wasn't having a good time, and he saw that Coco was there as well, so he went to her table, and they ended up going back to his place, and she stayed until 4 in the morning. He said he was sober, but so he doesn't have a hangover, but he's tired. So I think that's what he's referring to in relation to his tennis game. Okay, who was old Baturin? Well, Dmitri had this whole well-developed life in Tehran when he was staying there at the British legation from about May 1917 to August 1918. So he was there about a year, and he had a circle of friends, and he had things that he did there, and he took a really deep interest in what was going on in Persia at that time. It hadn't yet changed its name to Iran. And not surprisingly, because he tended to be interested in things like that, and Persia had a very volatile political situation. It was really the end of the era, and after the revolution, it was also really the end of the Great Game. So India and Persia had really been at the heart of the so-called Great Game, which was this rivalry between Russia and Britain as the primary actors to claim that part of the world. So Britain, of course, didn't want any incursions into India, very different countries. It hadn't been able to take Afghanistan any more than any other country has been able to take it and hold it, and it wanted to hang on to Persia, and there was sort of this tenuous stalemate in Persia, which was divided up into Russian and British sectors. Well, Tehran, so the British had the south, where the oil fields were, which turned out to be an advantage, although when all of this started, the oil fields weren't quite as desirable as they are now. Russia had the north, and it had a military base, basically, headquarters. I'm trying to think of the word. Anyway, it pretty much had taken over the town of Kazvin, which was exactly where Dmitri was initially sent. He had to leave and go to Tehran, but it had the north, and so then there were various nationalities in Tehran that were rivals, and so much so that it was decided to let Sweden supply the police, the gendarmerie for the country, because they needed a neutral state to provide the policing of the country. So the dynasty at that time, I don't know how to pronounce it, but it was Qajar, so it's spelled Qajar. The Q, of course, is not a stable letter in the sense of it could also be spelt other ways. You may remember the dictator in Libya, Gaddafi. You saw that sometimes spelled with a Q as well, and that's because there's no set, as far as I know, form of transliteration for that particular letter in Arabic. But anyway, that's the main spelling that I've seen. So Persia at that time had this, Dmitri calls it a division. Every other source I've seen calls it a brigade, but all follow Dmitri's lead and call it the Persian Cossack Division. So the officers in the Persian Cossack Division were all Russians. They were Russians who'd been seconded from the Russian army to lead the Persian Cossack Division. And the Cossacks themselves, so-called, and the NCOs were all Persians. And this was a major, technically it was the bodyguard of the Shah, but it was a major presence in the country as a whole. And it would be at the center of things in 1921 when there was actually a successful revolution or coup in Persia, and Dmitri had not been particularly welcome at the Russian legation in Persia. You know, they would invite him to dinners and things like that, but they weren't super encouraging. I think it was, as far as they were concerned, they were happy to have him off their hands and at the British legation, because it was very awkward to have any contact with a Romanov at that time. But he did make friends among the officers of the Persian Cossack Division, and really his best friend at that time was a man named Vsevolod Staroselsky, and Staroselsky was the second command. And then there was this rivalry within the division itself, and Staroselsky ended up ousting this fellow who was the head. I'm never sure his surname looks French to me, and it should be Clerget, Georgy Yosifovich, and he ended up going on to fight in the Civil War. I have a photograph of him here. That's him, the one on the right. And so Dmitri, he didn't take part in that, but he certainly knew exactly what was going on with that, because Staroselsky was such a close friend of his, and the two of them were both big-time gamblers. And there was one point where Dmitri owed a small fortune to Staroselsky and had to go to the Imperial Bank of Persia and get a loan and that sort of thing. But then eventually the tables turned, and Staroselsky ended up owning money to Dmitri from a gambling debt. And I had a brief correspondence with Staroselsky's niece, who was in Paris, an elderly woman, and she was very sweet and helpful, but unfortunately her uncle had not really left anything behind. So anyway, I'm letting I absolutely love that part of Dimitri's diaries, and I am actually more up on, I've done, more in-depth research on his time in Persia than his time in France. So I'm getting too caught up in that. But I should just mention that Dimitri is talking about, so Baturin, who he knew from Persia, who was part of the Persian, actually no, Baturin was a diplomat. He was on staff at the Russian legation. So he's now in Paris. He came to look Dimitri up. He's telling him about what's going on in Persia. The British are now, you could say, in the ascendant, but that will only last a short period of time. And what he tells Dimitri, as far as I can tell, is kind of nonsense. So he's telling Dimitri that the English have shut down the Persian Cossack division and chased out the Russian officers, Staroselsky and the others, and there's absolutely no Russian influence left in Persia. Duke! Sorry about that. And so, from what I know about it, it's practically the opposite, that the English were behind the, were supporting the Persian Cossack division, because there was a little revolution going on with the Persian Cossack division at that time, and one of the NCOs, I think his name was Reza Khan or Riza Khan, he would end up being the first non-Qajar. He would overthrow the dynasty and become the new Shah, establishing the Pahlavi family as the rulers of Persia. And so it was actually Pahlavi who was the Shah at the time of the revolution in, what was it, 1978, 1979. There was the American hostage crisis, and the Shah at that time was overthrown, and Iran became an Islamic state, as it still is to this day. So Dimitri was really in on the ground floor of all this, and he knew Pahlavi, and he knew Staroselsky, of course, but yeah, I mean, the Russians were out for sure, but I thought that the British were actually putting their support behind the Persian Cossack division. Maybe not. It's very confusing, and I haven't gone this far because, of course, Dimitri left in 1918 before all this happened. But Dimitri is writing this on the new calendar. The date of Dimitri's diary entry is the 11th of January, and basically the Persian Revolution is only, a little over a week away, 11 days away, because on the 22nd January, Reza Khan would march from Kazvin with Persian Cossacks and overthrow the dynasty and start his own dynasty as Reza Shah Pahlavi. He actually entered the Persian Cossack Brigade when he was only 14 years old. But anyway, okay, he would soon be successfully launching that coup within 11 days, and so I'm looking forward to seeing what Dimitri says about that when the news reaches him. Okay, so that's that whole first part. Apologies if that's not of interest to you, but if you're looking at all of this in a historical context, of course, it's an interesting topic. So then he goes to play tennis at the Tir au Pigeon, which I gather is a part of the Bois de Boulogne. There's a covered court there. His game is terrible because he was up so late the night before, into the wee hours of the morning. And then we have Coco. So Coco is really going to be pretty much a fixture from now on. So the two of them go off to have lunch at Larue. And Larue was a very famous Jazz Age restaurant in Paris. It still exists. Its owner, not its original owner, but its owner at this time had been a chef in Russia in very, very aristocratic households and came back and took over this restaurant, Larue. So there was a Russian connection, although Dmitry doesn't mention that. He goes there, and he and Coco are absolutely immersed in each other's company. So things are moving quickly with the relationship, and they really seem to be genuinely smitten with each other. They spend 2 or 3 hours there, just sitting there, as Dmitry says, and it was wonderful, and you can picture them looking into each other's eyes. All right, so afterwards he goes by his sisters, and then to the travelers, the usual haunts, and then he goes to the home of Nina de Polignac, who is a French marquise, but she is also an American woman, and Dmitry kind of gravitated to American women, so it's not surprising he eventually ended up marrying one. Linda Porter was also an American woman, and that seems maybe why she and Nina de Polignac were friends. So Cole and Linda Porter were there at Nina de Polignac's, and also this woman whom Dmitry identifies as Mrs. Gray and gives us our maiden name, which was Deacon. He very often gives maiden names. I'm not sure why. I don't think that necessarily means that when he knew her in Paris, she was still Miss Deacon instead of Mrs. Gray. Well, try Googling either Gray or Deacon, the surnames, and you are not going to get anywhere. She obviously was a person who belonged to this very glittering set, because he had known her in both Rome and Paris in 1914, and I think I mentioned once before that that was really the period when he was sowing his wild oats to a certain extent. You know, he was meeting all these glamorous people, not just Russian aristocrats and royals, but also members of this vast international social set in both Rome and Paris. Although 1914, that wasn't necessarily a very good year for him. I mean, obviously because of the war, but even before the war, he has talked about in his diaries as a boy, as a teenager, about this volatile temper that he had, and he would really lose his control of himself and lash out at people, and it seemed like he had outgrown this, but there's indication that that problem had reemerged in 1914, and he wrote this apology. He ended up in Sicily, and ostensibly for his health, the doctor had sent him there, and he wrote an apologetic letter to Nicholas II, specifically mentioning one of these outbursts of his. And, you know, there's always a question when he's talking about his physical health, whether there's a little bit of the depression and the mental health issue as well. And those two things are kind of mixed up together. So it's hard to tell which is which sometimes, because the family will refer to them as health crises rather than anything to do with depression or anything like that. But anyway, again, I'm digressing, talking about his life in 1914 in Paris, and we'll get to that when we get to 1914. So it was a really nice dinner, and instead of going back to spend more time with Coco, he goes in another direction, and my guess would be that that's probably because of her, that, you know, she was a busy woman, she was in demand, but so he resorts to the old, he goes back to the bat. So this will be the third time he's seen it. This Muscovite review that was going on in Paris at that time that he loved so much, and he took all of his friends to. So he makes a beeline for the bat and goes and takes these friends apparently with him, Nina de Polignac and Mrs. Gray and blah, blah, blah. And afterwards, he reverts to another thing that he does when he seems to be a little gloomy. He goes off with his buddy Pete Polovtsov to the Travelers, and Luders is there. And what happened the last time the three of them were together at the Travelers? Well, they went off to this sort of seemingly semi-brothel with the exotic decor, where they spent the night on divans getting up to nonsense, as Dmitry put it. So, but this time they if they end up there, he doesn't mention it. He just says that they get completely frightfully drunk, and when he gets home at 3 a.m., he is completely lit. And this is one thing I'm not being consistent with. I keep looking for the perfect word when he uses a slang term in Russian for saying that, falling down drunk. I try to think of a period friendly slang term in English for that. So tight is good, but I don't know that it quite goes far enough for what he's describing here. Snockered, I think, is American. I used that once before. So this time I resorted to lit, which is old. One doesn't really hear it anymore, at least not in the US. But anyway, you get the idea. I don't need to say more about that. So do come back. We are done for the moment with our flashbacks to Persia, so don't worry about that if you found that dull. And come back and we'll continue to follow the early days of this relationship with Coco, and you can decide for yourself how much it is a love relationship versus just having a good time. All right, I'll see you next time. Bye.